Hello and welcome to this video which focuses on the recovery from the 2010 and 11 Canterbury earthquakes in New Zealand. In particular, this video is going to explore some of the ways in which Canterbury as a region and Christchurch as a city has changed as a result of the earthquakes and recovery from them. However, while we will focus on elements of the physical change or changes in the physical landscape, we're also going to explore some of the ways in which the meanings and representations of Christchurch as a place has been contested and changed as a result of the disasters themselves. And in particular in this video, I'm going to, present to you some strands of evidence and of data which suggests that how people understand Christchurch as a place, what's seen as at home, what's seen as normal within these places, certainly has been contested as recovery has taken hold in the city. As such, the focus of this video is generally orientated towards secondary school level geography students who might be using the earthquakes as a case study in some form of geographic assessment. However, you might find that this video is also of interest to you if you have any form of focus or interest on disaster recovery or even Christchurch and certainly its experiences of the earthquakes themselves. My name is Dr. Simon Dickinson and I'm a lecturer in human geography. And as my accent might have already given away to you, Christchurch is my hometown. And certainly I've been involved in a number of research projects during the recovery period in the city. As the video progresses, we're going to explore a number of different elements or facets of this set of debates. Firstly, we're going to very briefly cover some of the characteristics of the earthquakes themselves and reflect on the impact that they've had, both psychologically and also physically on the landscape of the city itself. I'm then going to very briefly introduce you to the government recovery process and some of the concerns and criticisms leveraged at the top-down way in which recovery has taken place in the city. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, I'm going to introduce you to three strands, of evidence which suggests that the way in which Christchurch has been understood as a place might be changing or at least being contested as recovery takes place in the city. I'll then very briefly conclude with some reflections on this question of whether these meanings and representations of Christchurch as a place might be changing in the long term, or whether they might be just fixed or situated within the recovery period itself. So let's dive into it and start with a really brief overview of the earthquakes themselves and the impact that they have had. So in 2010, specifically on the 4th of September in the early hours of the morning, the city of Christchurch suffered relatively unexpectedly for those of us who were living there, a significant 7.1 magnitude quake. This was the largest magnitude quake that the city had experienced in a number of centuries, and certainly for those of us living there, we were unaware and certainly not prepared for the fact that the city might experience a significant shake. New Zealand sits on an alpine fault situated between two tectonic plates. However, growing up, I always remember being told that the earthquake would most likely take place in the capital city of Wellington in the North Island. And so I remember waking up in the early hours of this morning thinking that a significant earthquake meant that surely the city of Wellington must be completely devastated, that would be where the epicenter was. However, in this instance, the epicenter was located in an area just outside of Christchurch called Darfield, and the shake itself resulted in relatively wide-scale infrastructure damage. As you can see from the right-hand image, we see the facades of many buildings falling off or collapsing. We saw disruptions to electricity, water and waste in some areas for a number of weeks, but certainly at minimum a number of days. And as you can see on the image on the left-hand side, we see large-scale disruption as a result of infrastructure damage, such as road cracking, splitting, and ground upheaval. However, there weren't many fatalities in this particular instance, given that this occurred in the early hours of the morning. Most people were in bed, weren't in town, etc. So we see that impact and that sense of things being very small. However, if we move forward to February 2011, the scene or the picture is very different. On the 22nd of February, it was Tuesday lunchtime at 12:51 p.m, Christchurch was badly damaged by a magnitude 6.3 earthquake, which resulted in the loss of 185 lives. This was the most significant and deadly quake associated with this particular earthquake sequence. The earthquake epicenter was in an area called Littleton, which is about 10 kilometres southeast of the central business district of Christchurch, and occurred very kind of shallow level. So the earthquake occurred, although more than 5 months after the initial September shock. This was classified as an aftershock of the initial September event. Unfortunately, as I've already highlighted, 185 people passed away as a result of this quake, many of whom were located in specific buildings within the central business district of Christchurch. Most specifically, 115 people passed away in the CTV building, which CTV was a local television channel which took up much of the building, but was also home to, for example, international language schools as well. In other parts of the city, there were kind of minor injuries and some fatalities from falling facades, falling rocks around hill areas, etc. However, many of the fatalities were limited to the collapse of the CTV building and also the PGC building in the centre of town. So importantly, it's useful to note that the earthquake here in February brought down many buildings which already suffered structural damage in one of the earlier shakes, most specifically the September shake. And so we see very kind of significant buildings in the Christchurch city centre, such as the Anglican Christchurch Cathedral and the Catholic Cathedral of the Blessed Sacrament, receiving significant damage and having parts of facade or structure collapsing in itself. So this is the most significant event, both in terms of physical impact and fatalities. Importantly, before we dive into the focus of today's video, it's useful to acknowledge the impact of aftershocks in this particular earthquake sequence. And this is something which isn't covered in many of the media reports and ongoing attention related to these earthquakes. And this is related to the fact that the city itself suffered many thousands of aftershocks, ranging from significant to minor, in the years that followed. And as I've indicated on the slide in front of you right now, over 10,000 aftershocks were recorded up until the period of around about 2016. And this included a magnitude 6.0 earthquake in June 2011. Now, importantly, and what's useful to acknowledge if we're thinking about the long-term effects of the earthquake, but also in which the pace that the recovery has taken place, is that these aftershocks had and still have significant impact on the city itself and the people within it. So many of these aftershocks, for example, generated further soil and ground instability, sometimes leading to liquefaction. So this is kind of wet sands and soils emerging from the ground. I'll show you an image of which in the following slide. And these kinds of ground instabilities, which might impact the stability of buildings and homes, had important implications for those who were trying to receive insurance assessments and payouts in order to recover from the disaster itself. So in many instances, homeowners may have had a particular payout or have been waiting for a particular claim to be settled with an insurance company. An aftershock took place, which then prolonged that process. New surveys of homes and buildings might need to take place. A claim might have been settled, but then further damage has taken place, so a new claim might need to be taken or might need to be opened up. And in many instances, as I've put with the example quotes on the slide here, these raised very complex and difficult questions for individuals experiencing recovery, but also the logistics of trying to enable speedy recovery to take place. So new claims were constantly coming in. Buildings that were assessed one day may need to be reassessed again because of aftershocks, etc. And so these sorts of kind of issues related to insurance, related to home ownership, related to the ongoing experience of just, I guess, being in a landscape where things are shaking. When you hear the rumble, it sounds like a truck coming down the road. You're not sure if this is going to be another significant earthquake. This led to significant psychosocial and psychological impacts. This led in many instances to delayed kind of stress and poor mental health outcomes related to the earthquakes and to the disaster. And certainly, I remember personally many instances of consoling people who it may have just been a minor shake 3 or 4 years after the event, but things began to cascade. And this also has implications for mental health provision, health infrastructure, etc. So what we have here is almost a climate of uncertainty, of anxiety, which went well beyond the initial shakes themselves. So just to enable you to visualize some of this, we can see some of the images here of liquefaction, which takes place when loosely packed soils that tend to be waterlogged, which sit just below the ground surface, lose their strength as a result of the ground shaking and are forced upwards during an earthquake. And certainly liquefaction was associated with the most significant shakes in the Christchurch landscape. I remember the first thing that I heard when contacting my mum after the September earthquake was that she was battling to stop the house sinking. At that stage, I didn't know what that meant, but that was against the kind of rising liquefaction around the house. Importantly, aftershocks also led to liquefaction of varying degrees, and it was very common to see streets being completely cleared of silt, of sand and soil, and then after an aftershock, the street becoming covered again. So it was an ongoing concern and challenge in the landscape. So before I move on to presenting some of the evidence associated with the idea that the meanings attached to Christchurch might be changing, I want to really briefly highlight some of the common themes and ideas and priorities attached to the government handling of recovery. And I really encourage you to hold on to this moving forward, because many of the contestations around Christchurch as a place and the meanings attached to the city were formed in response to or around criticisms and concerns with the top-down way in which recovery in the city was taking place. One of the dominant themes or dominant ideas associated with government response to the earthquakes was a very quick movement of power away from local authorities and local government towards the national level. And the government at that time was led by the National Party, so it was national government led by the National Party. And in particular, we saw the creation of the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, otherwise known by its acronym of CERA, through the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Act in 2011. And this act gave CERA kind of unheralded and unseen kind of powers, and in particular the minister who oversaw this organisation, Jerry Brownlee, powers to control and manage the recovery process. And so what we saw here was a very purposeful and very direct and sudden movement away of power from local government and local authorities to national level. And powers here included, for example, the ability to forcibly acquire land and property in order to stimulate recovery, and these sorts of kind of powers, which in normal times were not available or not considered. As part of the government, control of the recovery process, we saw a number of projects and initiatives which drew criticisms of different kinds. So in one instance, we saw the implementation of a household zoning system where houses were zoned and land was zoned relative to the potential threat or risk to damage from future earthquake events. And a part of this process, including my own home, saw some homes forcibly acquired by the government. So 9,000 homes were what we call red zoned. And if you lived within the red zone, or your home or land was attached or labelled as red zoned, you were asked to sell your property to the government, which resulted in large pockets of the city, and I'll show you an image in a second, being vacated as it was deemed unsafe or at risk to future damage from earthquakes. And in particular, many of these homes were located either on hillsides, which were, challenged or at risk from rockfall, or also where the soil was seen as such poor quality that liquefaction and ground instability were going to be common challenges moving forward. And many of these homes were located near river areas of the city. As well as this focus on the red zoning in order to implement household recovery, we saw a particular focus in the central business district over large-scale redevelopment projects, what some call white elephant projects. And in particular, we see an emphasis on recovery taking place and economic stimulation taking place through large-scale projects such as a new sports stadium, a significant large convention centre, and a metro sports facility. And so these were large-scale projects in the centre of town which aimed to, generate or regenerate the city and bring about economic increase in productivity and performance. And so what we see here is some strong criticisms that recovery was very much being managed at the national level by politicians who were unaware or not sympathetic to the local complexities associated with the earthquakes. So keep that in mind moving forward. I'm going to show you some images just to make you visually aware of the impact of some of these schemes, but they're important to hold on to when we think about how meanings were changing and being contested. So what we can see here is aerial photography of some of the red zone neighbourhoods in Christchurch, very close to the central business district. These are pockets of neighbourhoods and pockets of city space in the city itself, which still to this day sit greening in some senses of the word, as contestations still take place about what to do with this land now that it has been deemed unavailable or inappropriate for building development on it. And that image there actually shows one of the streets on the right hand side where my home was before it was red zoned. Just to give you a sense of the impact on the central business district, we can see here the very centre of town a number of years after the earthquakes. This photo was taken in 2015 with a number of buildings already collapsed, already demolished, and many of these buildings still waiting to be demolished itself. So what I'd like to focus on in the last part of this video is some of the evidence that we can see that how Christchurch as a place was being negotiated, being contested, and possibly changing as recovery has taken place in the city. I'm going to introduce you to 3 strands of focus or evidence. And with each of these, I'm going to briefly describe how Christchurch was understood as a particular kind of place, at home to particular people, activities, economic activities before the earthquakes. And then I'm going to draw your attention to the activity of different organisations and different groups that might be trying to shift or change that representation in different ways as recovery takes place in the city. And certainly this is a very kind of brief overview. So I really encourage you to read around some of the resources I'll provide to you later on to think about how this might actually be taking place in practice. And so the first, evidence that we can see is that this representation and the understanding of the city might be changing is by looking at the image in which Christchurch was built. Christchurch as a city was formed and settled by British colonialists, and was really designed and constructed in this idea or image of the perfect English garden city. And we can see that in a number of ways. We can see that by looking at the infrastructure and activities in the city itself. So we have on the left-hand side here an image from pre-quake Christchurch with a band rotunda punting down the river. We can see this in the representations of Christchurch as a place. So the Christchurch City Council logo there, for example. Christchurch is normally called the Garden City, and we can see this image of this green city leading up to the cathedral. So we see particular iconography of a British city coming through, both in terms of architecture, but also in terms of logos and town planning. But you only need to walk down the street of any street in central Christchurch to get a sense or a visceral sense of how the city was built with this notion of model England in mind. Many of the central streets in Christchurch were named after English locations. So if I think about what the main streets in Christchurch are, I think of Worcester Street, Gloucester Street, Hereford Street, Victoria Street, these very kind of obvious English locations which have been used to name places in the Christchurch city. The river that you see on the image in front of you is the River Avon. So you can, in Christchurch, punt down the River Avon past the very English archetypal kind of architecture, or at least architecture that existed before the quake. Now, importantly, as part of this, we see a city being constructed in the image of the perfect or the ideal British city. However, that comes at almost a price. What we see here is a very purposeful and deliberate exclusion of indigenous claims to that urban space. And particularly what we see lacking in the pre-quake city was an acknowledgement of Māori indigenous heritage and histories in the formation of the city. Now, one of the ways in which we might argue that this is changing after the earthquakes is we can begin to see a more deliberate recognition of both Māori history and claims to land and rights taking place in the city, but also a very kind of deliberate inclusion of Māori heritage, of language and character in the re-emerging city. Now we can see that most specifically in the naming of buildings, which might feel like a very kind of mundane action, but is a very purposeful way of recognizing presence and history in particular places. So what we see on the right-hand side here is an image of the recently opened in 2018 Christchurch Central City Library, public library, which has been called Turanga, a very kind of obviously Māori term. We can see inclusions of Māori kind of participation in redevelopment sort of organisations and recovery organisations in the city. So Māori wardens have roles to play both in terms of immediate recovery aftermath, but also having a say in longer term decision making in the city. So we can see here, as we kind of rebuild the city, a more explicit notion of the multicultural way in which, or land on which, the city is formed. Importantly, and as we move on to the second strand here, we can see a particular kind of conservatism attached to the city being broken in different ways as recovery has taken place. Now, that earlier kind of discussed notion of Christchurch as a very Anglophile kind of English city built in, I guess, this idea or image of a perfect English city had implications for the kinds of activities that were seen as in place or appropriate in Christchurch as a city. So before the earthquakes, Christchurch was seen as a relatively politically conservative place. There was particular architectures that had an economy which was largely built historically on agriculture and farming, and being a particular kind of home to trade related to agricultural industries taking place outside of the city. It was seen as a very white middle-class city. It is demographically a very white middle-class city with overrepresentations of British white populations and high income earners. And so these kind of demographic characteristics and economic industrial legacies have led to the city prior to the quakes being kind of considered as a very sort of conservative place. Edgy, fringe, arts and cultural activities were never really at home, and it almost became a bit of a joke in the country that Christchurch was a kind of white, boring place. There was a form of kind of political and economic conservatism which was associated with the kinds of people who supposedly lived there. However, after the earthquake, we see this being challenged in different ways. We see the emergence of different forms of organisations who are kind of using space in very kind of creative and edgy ways. And in particular, we saw the rise of a range of community organisations, non-governmental organisations, who are using spaces in the city which were home to previously home to buildings which were demolished, knocked down, and using these in really creative ways. So, for example, we can see on the right-hand side here, in collaboration with the City Council, being invited, an organisation inviting people to think about what public space and governance and welfare looks like in the city moving forward, asking very kind of political questions. On the left-hand side, we see an image here, and I'm going to show you some more images on the next slide, from an organisation called Gap Filler, which is an organisation who have become internationally kind of famous and well known and regarded for the ways in which they used empty spaces in the immediate aftermath of recovery. And in particular, we see parts of the city being used as a giant monopoly board here. This kind of frivolous sort of use of space, but a very kind of political edge where attention was being drawn to the way in which spaces were being kind of sold off to the highest bidder. So we see these edgy kind of arty activities with a very kind of political edge to them. And we can see this coming through in a variety of contexts as well. So Gap Filler were also involved with the dancer mat on the right-hand side. So there's a public kind of dance mat on a former demolished site with a jukebox, and people can go and dance and just enjoy themselves and hang out. We can see different forms of kind of creative, arty type interventions. The Palette Pavilion on the bottom right-hand side there was an open-air kind of performance space made entirely out of pallets where bands would perform. You'd have community events, these sorts of things. We have things like the Grandstandium, which was a movable stand where the organisation Gap Filler would take it around and you could observe buildings being demolished and changes taking place in the city centre, and at the same time you would have a commentary about the kind of historical and social values of these spaces. And while these seem like very mundane kind of artsy, slightly different activities, these are the sorts of kind of slightly different activities which were never quite at home in pre-quake Christchurch. And certainly the co-founders of the organisation Gap Filler, and I'll point you to this resource later on, drew attention to the fact that for many years they tried these sorts of projects in a non-disaster type environment prior to the event. However, it never took off. There was never support. They weren't seen as being normal or useful in any way. But the earthquakes enabled them to question what was seen as at home in Christchurch as a place. The last strand I want to draw your attention towards is what we might call growing political discontent. And I apologise for the slightly graphic image on the right-hand side of the slide or screens at the moment. But another way in which we might observe the fact that the meaning of Christchurch was being negotiated, was being contested as recovery took hold, was the fact that in the aftermath of the earthquakes during the recovery period, we saw large-scale mobilisation and protest around different kinds of social issues, that many of which existed prior to the earthquakes. However, with the kind of layer of earthquakes and earthquake recovery on top of them, really took hold and grew and what we might say burgeoned as a result of recovery taking place. So on the left-hand side, for example, we have a protest around kind of education provision. Now, one of the decisions, and very contentious decisions, that the education minister took as a result of people moving from the earthquakes, or as a result of the earthquakes, was to close a number of local schools. However, this led to wide-scale protest and discontent, in part to do with the fact that the minister was using the earthquakes arguably as a reason to close these schools. But it also became a bigger, broader debate about education provision, about the quality of education, about the kind of politics that the government had been putting in the country over the last sort of 10 years or so. So whilst this had a kind of connection to the earthquakes itself, what we actually saw was this large-scale growing of protest and discontent that the earthquakes fueled, and allowed people to challenge what was seen as normal or acceptable or appropriate in this particular setting. On the right-hand side, we see, I guess, a similar kind of case study, but from a different context. What we have here is a large-scale sculpture by a famous New Zealand artist of the then Environment Minister defecating into a glass. And this was about the kind of erosion of water quality, or the lowering of water quality as a result, what was seen to be as a result of large-scale kind of industrial farming and kind of regulation of environmental conditions in the broader Canterbury region. And while kind of concern and discontent around environmental management had been kind of simmering away in Christchurch for a number of years, in particular with the Environment Agency called Environment Canterbury, the post-earthquake scenario and landscape became a place where this discontent grew, where people began to mobilise, where support came together, different sorts of protest movements almost fed off each other in a way because of the momentum generated by the disaster itself. So while this kind of concern around environmental management had its roots in part in earthquake recovery and to do with regulation around home building and house kind of reconstruction after disasters, actually what we see here is a particular moment in time where a range of factors were coming together and were enabling enough support that the kind of what was considered to be as normal, to be acceptable, to be reasonable, was being challenged because of that widespread support. So I feel as though I've rambled on for far too long in what was supposed to be a very kind of short mini lecture, but I want to conclude with, I guess, a couple of propositions and statements. So firstly, I want to argue, and what I hope has become very clear through this video, is that recovery in Christchurch isn't about a return to normal. The normal that we had before the disaster, before the earthquakes, isn't possible. There's been too much physical damage. There's been too much psychological damage and impact as a result of the disaster. We are never going to return to the city that existed prior to the disaster. It was too catastrophic. It was too violent. Its impacts were too widespread for that to be able to be possible. Rather, what we can see here is actually the disaster and its recovery generating spaces where people can test and try to change the meanings attached to Christchurch as a city. And what we can see, as I've covered in this lecture very briefly, is that in Christchurch, actually, there's been a lot of contestation about what Christchurch should be moving towards. We have this top-down vision from government of this large-scale redevelopment project or set of projects which brings in economic investment, formed around this large-scale convention centre, sports stadium, etc. And then we also have community groups really contesting and trying to build a new notion of what is normal or acceptable in the city itself. So the disaster has changed, or is leading to change, about what is considered to be in place, what is considered to belong in the city of Christchurch itself. So I want to conclude today with, I guess, a sort of, question or reflection to you listening today. And I want you to think a little bit carefully about what the long-term picture might look like here. And in many ways, this is still up in the air. During recovery, we've seen all sorts of really interesting debates and negotiations and contestations around how Christchurch might be changing as a place. one of the criticisms put forward to many of the organisations that emerged, the community organisations that emerged after the disaster, is that actually they haven't really led to widespread change. That actually they had a purpose when recovery was taking place, when those gaps appeared in the city centre, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the character and the notion of kind of the meanings of Christchurch changing, but rather they just served a purpose to get people involved in recovery, and that the longer term picture might be a return in some way to a status quo of Christchurch as a kind of colonial white city that's very conservative in different ways. So I'm not going to leave you with an answer, I'm going to leave you with a question of how do you think you would observe that moving forward? What sorts of things would you focus on? How would you measure if this kind of changing meaning and attachment to Christchurch as a place has actually happened? What sorts of things would you look at? I'm really keen to hear your answers, and please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you so much for listening to this mini lecture. Please feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions, any further kind of information that would be helpful to you. But hopefully this was a brief introduction to the recovery process in Christchurch itself.